Good evening, everyone. Great to see so many people out tonight on this dark and stormy evening. And we were afraid we might have to cancel, but the gods of the temperature have kept us wet and not frozen. So I'm delighted that you all made it up tonight to the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George Washington. For those of you who's your first time here for our evening book talks, my name is Doug Bradburn. I'm the founding director of the library, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here to this great institution. Now, these evenings are possible because of the generosity of the Ford Motor Company. The Ford Motor Company has been friends to Mount Vernon for many, many years, going back to Henry Ford, bringing the first fire truck, fire engine, fire machine to put out fires to Mount Vernon back in the 1920s. It's a cause that we all obviously believe in, and we're delighted to have Ford supporting us over this long century almost now. Ford supports a lot of the educational endeavors here, and they supported our new garden book, which was recently published, and I hope you'll take a look for, and also many other things. So it's a very exciting series that we have, and I hope you've looked at our website to see what's coming up. The next Ford Evening Book Talk with Lynn Cheney has a new book on James Madison, which has gotten good reviews, and we're excited to see that. But in May, we also have Kathleen Bartoli-Tuzan, who's a longtime researcher at the Papers of the First Federal Congress Project at George Washington University, who wrote a whole book about the title controversy of George Washington in the presidency. So as we see ourselves in the Washington Library as a presidential library for George Washington, we love to bring the stories of the presidency to life here as well. All right, so without further ado, Jonathan Horn is standing here, looming next to me, the main event, ready to go, chomping at the bit, and let me tell you why. He's a very polished writer, and in fact, a well-known author, although you might not know him as the author of these things because he's a longtime speechwriter for the former president, for President George W. Bush in the White House. So you've heard Jonathan Horn your whole lives. You just didn't know it. So when you hear the audio version of this book, you'll say, I recognize those ringing tones. But actually, those of you who haven't had a chance to read any of the book, I really encourage you to get it. You'll want to get it after he gives his talk, but it's beautifully written. And that is not always something that you can say about history books, but it's a great story for those of us in this region who love Virginia history, who love the Washington story, who are familiar with Lee's story as well. It's a tremendous book to get a hold of. He's written for the New York Times Disunion series, the very award-winning Disunion series commemorating the Civil War, as well as the Weekly Standard. He's been on TV as a commentator at MSNBC, BBC Radio, PBS NewsHour, C-SPAN, and he lives locally. He lives in Bethesda, Maryland. We're going to claim Bethesda as in our orbit of influence, so he's a local resident. We can't quite make him a neighborhood friend, but we'll welcome him as a friend here to Mount Vernon. So please, welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Doug, for that very kind introduction, and thank you for having me here today. As was mentioned, I used to work as a presidential speechwriter before I started writing this book. So you can imagine my shock when I discovered that one person who didn't much care for my old occupation was the subject of my new book, Robert E. Lee. In fact, Robert E. Lee was so offended when he heard that George Washington might have employed a ghostwriter for his famous farewell address that he refused to believe it. And he said that anyone who made this claim was, quote, injudicious. So if I've learned nothing else from writing this biography, it's that I should say a little bit less about my own biography. Thank you for the warm welcome again. I am so honored to be back at the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George Washington. And I say back because I came here during my research for this book. And in fact, to be honest, I was anxiously counting the days until this library opened because I really wanted to see your collection. And I got great help when I got here from Michelle Lee and Mary Thompson. And I just want to thank everyone who works here for building a library that is truly worthy of George Washington. Of the enormous demand for books about Washington, Robert E. Lee once said, It speaks greatly in favor of the people and must tend vastly to their benefit in every respect. That was true in Robert E. Lee's time, and it's true in our time. So that's why this library's mission is so important. I confess that at first glance, I'm an unlikely person to write a biography of Robert E. Lee. I grew up in the, as was mentioned, the Maryland suburbs of Washington, and I live there now again. And you should have seen some of the looks I got when I told people around there that I was planning to write a biography of Robert E. Lee. It's understandable, after all. Around those parts, when you say you're planning to write a Civil War biography, people expect it to be about a Union general, not a Confederate. And they especially don't expect it to be about that Confederate general, the marble model himself. For a long time, I avoided explaining myself. I did what you do expect someone from Washington to do when confronted with a tough question. I ducked it. No more. Tonight, I want to explain myself. What first drew me to Robert E. Lee's story is probably what you would least expect: simple geography. Lee and I grew up along the same river, the Potomac. Now that sounds surprising for two reasons. First, when we think of the Potomac River, we tend to think about George Washington, not Robert E. Lee. It's the city of Washington that lies on the Potomac. It's the Washington Monument that towers above that city. And it was Washington who believed that the Potomac had a great destiny for this country, that it would connect east and west, and that it would serve as an artery for traders and settlers. By contrast, when we think of Robert E. Lee, we tend to imagine him personifying an old South that seems light years away from the cosmopolitan capital city that Washington has become. But the truth is far different. Reminders of Robert E. Lee are all around us. And one of those reminders is the majority of Lee's papers, which are thankfully for me, were in driving distance of Washington, which made my job quite easy. But writing a biography requires more than just looking at old papers, important as that is. It also requires getting out and seeing the places where history took place. And Lee's history took place all around us. During the course of my research on this book, my wife and I traveled the full length of the Potomac River, from its source in West Virginia at the Fairfax Stone, where the river starts as a little trickle, to Point Lookout, Maryland, where the Potomac empties into the Chesapeake Bay. We actually went that full distance, and I dragged my wife along. So for those of you wondering, of all the things you need to write a biography, an understanding spouse, that's tops. But if you ever take this journey that we took along the Potomac, you learn some things. You learn why the Potomac River enchanted George Washington as much as it did. It is a beautiful river. You learn that Robert E. Lee's history flows up and down this river, and you learn that in the most unexpected ways, Robert E. Lee's history intersects and flows into George Washington's history. Start far downriver in Westmoreland County, Virginia, near the Chesapeake Bay, where Robert E. Lee was born on a great plantation called Stratford Hall. Stratford Hall was originally built by Robert E. Lee's great-great-uncle, Thomas Lee. Now, Thomas Lee has a distinction that no other American has. It's that he sired two signers of the Declaration of Independence. And the great house that he built at Stratford Hall was a symbol of the great wealth the Lee family had accumulated on the Potomac River. They truly were one of Virginia's finest families. And not far from Stratford Hall, in Westmoreland County, you'll find where George Washington was born. Now, by the time Robert E. Lee was born in 1807, George Washington was dead. But the Washington and Lee names had already been fused together, and that was because of Robert E. Lee's father, a man named Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. Now, Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee served as a cavalry commander for George Washington during the Revolutionary War. That's where he got the nickname Lighthorse. But what he's most famous for is what he did after the war, what he did when George Washington died. He eulogized George Washington as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Now those, of course, are still the words that we remember George Washington by today. And in Robert E. Lee's time, everybody knew that his dad had written those words. Now, much as Harry Lee admired George Washington, he couldn't quite imitate what he knew was George Washington's greatest virtue, self-control. Harry Lee bet all of his money on land, and unlike George Washington, he wasn't too good at this, and he lost all of his money on land. He ends up in debtor's prison, and eventually during the War of 1812, he sails off into exile in the Caribbean. Young Robert never saw his dad again. So Robert E. Lee didn't grow up on a great plantation in Westmoreland County. Those financial struggles made that impossible. He often was in homes belonging to friends and relatives who took pity on his poor mother. To find where Robert E. Lee spent his childhood, you have to head upriver to the town of Alexandria. And today, of course, we know Alexandria as Alexandria, Virginia. But when Robert E. Lee was a child, it was Alexandria in the District of Columbia. It was George Washington who tucked Alexandria into the bottom corner of his original plan for the diamond-shaped District of Columbia. And actually, if you look at a map of Washington today and you add Arlington and Alexandria into it, you'll see that you end up with a perfect diamond-shaped square. And as the town closest to Mount Vernon, Alexandria very much considered itself to be George Washington's hometown. Young Robert didn't have to look far to see reminders of George Washington. He went to school at an academy that George Washington had endowed. He went to church, at a church where George Washington had owned a pew. And he ran errands for his mother in the marketplace, where George Washington had drilled troops during the French and Indian War. The descriptions we have of Robert E. Lee's childhood describe him as anything but a boy, as a devoted nurse tending to his mother, who was always sick, as a housekeeper running her errands. Now, no one understood better what caused Harry Lee's downfall than Robert E. Lee's mother, and she determined to give her son the virtue that his father lacked. She taught her son economy. She taught her son how to put others' emotions before his own. He learned to put duty over desire. And for the rest of Robert E. Lee's life, he would talk as if he was playing a role in a script beyond his control. He would often say he could never have his own way. Young Robert might want for much, but he would not want for the virtue that had separated his father from George Washington. He would know how to control himself. But to find what most connects Robert E. Lee to George Washington, you have to head a little bit further upriver from Alexandria to that great pillared mansion that sits atop the Arlington Heights across the Potomac River from the Lincoln Memorial, Arlington House. There on June 30th, 1831, Robert E. Lee married the daughter of George Washington's adopted son, a man named George Washington Parke Custis. Now, today, of course, we know Arlington is a cemetery. But back then, it was actually very much a shrine to George Washington. And Custis liked to invite people over to his house. In fact, he treated it very much as a museum. And if you had gone to Arlington in the first half of the 19th century, you would have seen all kinds of different relics of George Washington. You would have seen furniture. You would have seen portraits and china that had once adorned this house, Mount Vernon. You would have even seen the bed where George Washington had died, and Custis liked to say that supposedly he kept it in the exact same condition that Washington had left it. And you would have seen something else, a sadder legacy of Mount Vernon, slaves who had descended from this house. Now you might ask yourself, how is that possible? Didn't George Washington emancipate all of his slaves when he died? He did emancipate all of his slaves, but he couldn't, much as he wanted to, emancipate his wife's slaves. And some of those slaves became the property of George Washington Parke Custis. Now, Robert E. Lee thought slavery was an evil institution. But he actually, and this is going to sound very strange to you all tonight, he actually thought it was worse for whites than for the slaves themselves. He prayed for a day that God would end slavery, but he certainly was no abolitionist. He essentially wanted to have as little to do with slavery as possible. But what most entangles him in the institution of slavery is his marriage to the daughter of George Washington's adopted son. That's because in 1857, George Washington Parke Custis dies, and he leaves a will naming Robert E. Lee as executor of his estates. And those estates include slaves who have descended from Mount Vernon. So in the years before the Civil War, in the late 1850s, Robert E. Lee is living in Arlington House, managing slaves who George Washington wanted to, but could not free. And so the unresolved question of slavery was very much one of the personal legacies that Robert E. Lee inherited from George Washington. And to see how the unresolved question of slavery led to violence, you have to head about 60 miles upriver from Arlington, further up the Potomac, to the quaint little town of Harper's Ferry. It had been George Washington's idea to wedge a federal armory between three towering bluffs in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And this only made sense if you believed, as Washington did, that the Potomac would one day become a great gateway to the West. But in 1859, a group of abolitionists, led by one John Brown, crossed the Potomac River, seized the armory, and took a group of hostages, including a great-grandnephew of George Washington, a man named Lewis Washington. And John Brown took something else from Lewis Washington. He took a sword that had belonged to George Washington. And for most of the time that John Brown holds Harper's Ferry, he carries this sword belonging to George Washington around with him. So who does the federal government send out to reassert federal control over Harper's Ferry? Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee. And Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee had already earned by this time a reputation as being one of the country's most talented soldiers. He had earned that reputation during the Mexican-American War. And he very much lives up to this reputation at Harper's Ferry. He puts down the insurrection, he reasserts federal control, and what becomes known as John Brown's raid adds another laurel to Lee's sparkling resume. But it also does something else. It heralds the coming of the American Civil War. And so I want to mention one more place on this trip up the Potomac River. That brings me to the last place I want to mention. It's just a little bit further upriver from Harper's Ferry. It's a quiet national park. There you'll find a cornfield, a sunken road, and a stone bridge over a creek called the Antietam. There on September 17, 1862, Robert E. Lee and the outmanned and outgunned Army of Northern Virginia fought the much, much larger Army of the Potomac to a draw and the bloodiest day of combat in American history. The Battle of Antietam marked the end of Robert E. Lee's first invasion across the Potomac and gave Abraham Lincoln the opportunity to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation and eventually to give a new birth of freedom to the Union George Washington forged. Now, anyone who takes this journey that I've just described, anyone who traces Robert E. Lee's history up the Potomac River, faces an inevitable question. How did an Army officer so associated with George Washington's legacy go to war against George Washington's greatest legacy, the Union? It was this question that ultimately drew me to Robert E. Lee's story. It's this tragic tension in the knowledge that history could have turned out so much differently. Because on the eve of the Civil War, leaders on both sides of the Potomac, in Washington and in Virginia, sought Lee's services for high command. Leaders on both sides knew about Lee's connections to George Washington and saw tremendous significance in them. And leaders on both sides knew that Winfield Scott, who at that time was the U.S. Army's ranking general, had said that Robert E. Lee was the very best soldier he ever saw in the field. And Lee certainly looked like a good soldier. He had broad shoulders, a barreled chest. He stood just under 6 feet tall. He had perfect posture, unlike mine, which is a little bit more like a writer's posture. And everyone who saw Robert E. Lee said some version of the same thing. They said, that man looks every inch a soldier. So in April 1861, an emissary for Abraham Lincoln, a man named Francis Blair, calls Robert E. Lee to the city of Washington for a meeting. So Robert E. Lee rides over from Arlington House and comes to Washington to meet with Mr. Blair. And Francis Blair has an incredible offer for Robert E. Lee. He says, will you lead the main Union Army being raised to crush secession? And as Lee remembers the story, Blair tries in every way to convince him to say yes. Blair says to Lee, the country looks to you, quote, as the representative of the Washington family. And that was hardly an exaggeration, because here, after all, we have the son of George Washington's most famous eulogist and the son-in-law of George Washington's adopted child. And so what did Robert E. Lee say to Francis Blair? Well, he said he opposed secession, and he did oppose secession. He thought secession was illegal. And equally significantly, Robert E. Lee thought George Washington would not have condoned secession. And that was no given at the time, because people on both sides of this conflict are going to try to claim George Washington for their own. Confederates are going to say that George Washington had once rebelled against a union, albeit one with the British. Unionists are going to say, look at George Washington's farewell address. He said, prize the Union above any local allegiance. And actually, in the months before the Civil War, Robert E. Lee reads a biography of George Washington, and he concludes that Washington would have mourned the destruction of the Union. So what else does Robert E. Lee have to say to Francis Blair? He says that he would gladly wash his hands of the institution of slavery, gladly do away with the whole thing if it meant avoiding war. But how can he raise his sword against his native state of Virginia? Now here, Blair family tradition says that Lee paused, as if searching for some kind of answer. But as Lee told the story, he gave his answer once and at once: no. For all of his devotion to the Union, he could not imagine going to war against the state he called home, Virginia. He turned down that offer, but he did not yet turn in his commission in the Army that he had served in for more than 3 decades. He returns to Arlington. Soon afterward, he learns that Virginia has, in fact, voted to secede, as he expected it would. And on April 20th, 1861, after what Robert E. Lee's wife describes as the severest struggle of his life, Robert E. Lee resigns from the U.S. Army. But just 3 days after this severe struggle, Robert E. Lee shows up at the Virginia State Capitol in Richmond and accepts command of all of Virginia's state forces. The president of the Virginia Secession Convention welcomes Robert E. Lee essentially as the heir to George Washington, and says that he prays for a day when what once was said about George Washington will be true of Robert E. Lee, that he is first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Robert E. Lee had forever cast his fate south of the Potomac. Now, Robert E. Lee would say that this wasn't so much the right choice as it was the only choice. It was very much like him to say he couldn't have his own way, so he would have Virginia's way. But yet we do know that other Virginians went a different way. Winfield Scott, who I mentioned, who was the ranking U.S. general, was also a Virginian, and he decided to stay with the Union. And when Robert E. Lee told him that he had turned down the command of the main Union Army being raised, what did Winfield Scott say to Robert E. Lee? He said, "Lee, you have made the greatest mistake of your life, but I feared it would be so." And Scott was right. Lee paid a terrible price. One of the very first things that happens is that Union soldiers in Washington cross the bridges and go up the Arlington Heights and seize that high ground. And if you've ever stood in Washington and looked at Arlington, you know immediately why they did it. Because imagine what the Confederates or the Virginians could have done if they had fortified Arlington Heights. They could have bombarded the White House. So Robert E. Lee and his family start this war, worrying about the fate of their house and all the Mount Vernon relics they had left behind. Shortly afterward, Robert E. Lee takes the field for the first time in Western Virginia. Who does he bring as an aide? A man named John Augustine Washington III. Another one of George Washington's great-grandnephews, and the heir to Mount Vernon, who actually sold the house to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And John Augustine Washington III is going to die under Robert E. Lee's command, and this death devastates Lee. It really embitters him against the Union. And in time, as casualties on both sides mount, more men die, Union authorities are going to make a decision to convert Arlington, the estate where Robert E. Lee married the daughter of George Washington's adopted son, into the cemetery we know today. And those are just a few examples of the price Lee paid. I think as you read more, you'll be shocked because it is so astonishingly personal. The decision Robert E. Lee made to fight against the Union tore his bonds to its founder in the most agonizing of ways. Now, my wife will tell you that the reason I became so interested in this decision is because I'm not actually the best at making decisions myself. I have a great affinity for being able to change my mind, and that's a luxury a writer has. You can research something, you can put it down in paper, and you can change it as many times as you like. Robert E. Lee never had that luxury. There was no going back. He never stepped foot at Arlington again. We talk so often about social movements and trends that we sometimes forget that history isn't inevitable. It can pivot on the decision of a single individual. Here was such a moment. Here was such a man. The decision Robert E. Lee made forever changed the course of American history. And if you wonder how it changed American history, just ask yourself the counterfactual. What would have happened if Robert E. Lee had accepted that command from Francis Blair? What would have happened if Robert E. Lee saved the Union? What would we make of the fact if a man so closely connected to George Washington saved the Union that George Washington had created? How would that change our outlook on America? Well, I think the best place to ponder that question is just to go a little upriver from Mount Vernon to Arlington House. If you go up the hillside, past the graves of men who died fighting to save George Washington's Union, and you stand beside the house that was originally built as a memorial to George Washington, but is now actually a memorial to Robert E. Lee. And if you stare across the Potomac River at the city of Washington, you'll see the Washington Monument rise in the distance. But before the Washington Monument is the Lincoln Memorial. And that's a powerful symbol for our country. Because for all of Robert E. Lee's connections to George Washington, he is no longer the American we most closely associate with George Washington. That honor belongs to the man who saved the Union. That honor belongs to Abraham Lincoln. Herman Melville once wrote, "Who looks at Lee must think of Washington, in pain must think and hide the thought, so deep with grievous meaning it is fraught." Well, I think we've hidden the thought for too long. I think we've looked away for too long. I hope you'll read my book, and I hope you'll go out and see this history for yourself, because it's all around you at this house and around this area. Thank you, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
The founding director has the prerogative to ask the first question. That's the key. I mean, I grew up in Virginia. The great thing about Virginia, unlike a lot of the United States, which is the best country in the world, is that the history is here. It's present. It's around you. Mistakes, tragedies, as well as, great successes, great stories. And what you've given us is a tremendous look into the complexity of Virginia's history and Lee's particular story. Lee grew up in the District of Columbia, which strikes me as ironic because he's associated so much with Virginia and the Lee story. And I learned that from your book, which I kind of would have known, I guess, about it. Yeah, because I knew that Alexandria was ceded back and all that. But, yeah, when you put it together, he's actually growing up in the district, which is extraordinary in it. And I also love your way of describing Arlington House as really the first monument to Washington. This is a place which he describes vividly in his book, is not only filled with all these items, some of which are now in the mansion itself, all these memorabilia of Washington's family, some of which we've only recovered at Mount Vernon in the last decade, that was hidden by Lee, was buried at VMI or somewhere, and has come to light, these silver wine, whatever it is. Yeah, right. Decorative arts people are groaning right now. But, and the fact that Custis, George Washington Park, Custis has got his lawn, he's got the marquee tent of George Washington, which, by the way, a duplicate of will be at Mount Vernon in May when we put on this great encampment. We're going to have the duplicate marquee here at Mount Vernon. That would be out. He'd have the sheep out that are connected to Mount Vernon sheep at Arlington House. I just found this extraordinary, that Arlington House is basically the Mount Vernon of the antebellum period. And then to see it turned into the National Cemetery, which is so extraordinary, potent with meaning. I congratulate you on connecting these stories in such an interesting way. Now, the question is, you're counterfactual. Would Lee have had success putting down rebellion in Virginia? Or would he have fallen into the same mistakes that many of the Union generals had, which was, until Grant, their unwillingness to expose men in a way that required them to put down this insurrection?
And that's a great question. I think it's sort of the central question that we all wonder: how would history have been different if he had accepted that command? Would he have been? I mean, there of course is this possibility that Robert E. Lee would have accepted the command, and then he would have been George McClellan. Yeah. And then the Washington connection might not mean that much anyway. But Robert E. Lee was a brilliant military mind. I think it was noticed before the war, and it was certainly noticed during the war. And so we can't answer your question. Anybody could take their best shot at guessing what could have happened. It's so impossible to say because it didn't happen. And it's one of the great things that we can't answer about American history. But there's this wonderful moment in 1869, and I said that sometimes when confronted with a hard question, someone from Washington will duck a question. So anyway, you can see what I'm about to do here. But in 1869, Robert E. Lee goes to the White House, and he meets with Ulysses S. Grant. And every American war to that date had always sent at least one general to the White House. And it's this just amazing moment where Robert E. Lee sits down with Ulysses S. Grant, and you have to wonder what was going through his head. I mean, was there a part of him that wondered if things could have been different? I actually think probably not, because I think he really felt that this was the only decision he could make, and I actually don't think there was any scenario when he would have actually accepted Francis Blair's offer. But the offer was there, and that's what makes this story so compelling.
Add on to that question, how many Virginia Unionists who voted for the Constitutional Union Party of these leading families, when they saw Lee's decision, said, I'm going to side with the Confederacy?
And that's another excellent...
That might be a bigger impact on the actual generalship.
That's an excellent point, because there were a lot of, and even within Lee's own family, we see that happening, where other people are on the fence. And for example, Robert E. Lee's wife, Mary, who was the daughter of George Washington Parke Custis, described herself, or was described by her daughter, as very much of a Unionist. And so we can't.
Well, in Virginia, as you know, cast their electoral votes for this, congressional or Constitutional Union Party for Bell.
Right.
That was the kind of direction.
Right, and that ticket.
It's not a choice.
And by the way, that ticket is for the VP candidate. They had a Washington biographer on the ticket, so that just gives you a sense of how important George Washington was. Brilliant. And so, I think Robert E. Lee would have said he couldn't have, and this was something about his own way of looking at the world. He had this feeling that he couldn't impact anything, that he just had to sort of carry out his destiny and fate. So he would have said he had no control over the situation. But I think you're right. I think he actually did have some control. And if he had made a different decision, it's possible others would have also made a different decision. But again, I don't think he ever would have made that other decision. It's this great moment, and Blair has this, as the Blair family tells the story, he did pause. But Lee says essentially that he couldn't have made any other decision. The closest he gets in some ways to acknowledging that he could have made a different decision is after the war. He's having a conversation, and someone says to him, Winfield Scott decided to stay with the Union. He was a Virginian. And Lee said there were good reasons on both sides. And that's as close as you're going to get from Robert E. Lee to acknowledging that perhaps he did have a decision to make.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with counterfactuals. It isn't what happened. And what happened for a reason, So it is hard. It is so hard to get your head around it. Now, we'll open it up for questions. Indulge me one more. I don't know if you had a chance to see when you were here doing research the new acquisition we had of the play that George Washington Parke Custis wrote called The Monongahela, or George Washington on the Monongahela, which was supposedly a play that was one night only in New York City in the 1830s, which we acquired at auction. One of the earliest things we got after we opened the library, actually, it's an extraordinary manuscript play. And I wondered if you had, A, a chance to see that, B, what do you know about George Washington Parke Custis' sort of failed, playwright career at all? Yeah.
Well, actually, I did not get to see that. I wish I did get a chance to see that.
It's over in the vault.
I'm gonna come back to see that soon.
Yeah.
So George Washington Parke Custis, you said it very much, but was considered himself to be a playwright. Some of his plays did better than other plays. This sort of gives you a sense of his personality. Robert E. Lee kind of made fun of him a little bit in the background. All the Lee brothers kind of had a little bit of a laugh at his expense. He also painted these enormous pictures of George Washington. And he gave speeches about George Washington. And this, to be perfectly honest, is pretty much all George Washington Parke Custis did with his life. He didn't pay too much attention to financial affairs. And that's why he left this disastrous will in 1857 that puts Robert E. Lee in charge of an estate that is completely a disaster because Custis had been spending his entire life telling stories about his childhood. So the playwriting is a big part of understanding, I think, who George Washington Parke Custis is.
Interesting. All right, so let's open it up. I saw right here first.
Well, I just want to follow up on something you said. Last year being the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, I was absolutely stunned to read at the time how many Virginian representatives in the federal government voted to stay with the Union. And how and when did somebody decide in Richmond that no, Virginia was going to secede? And that was, Virginia paid probably the highest price in the Civil War to begin with. And at some point, it would seem to me that it became rather obvious that this secession was a disaster. And why didn't the war stop? Sort of like in our Revolutionary War in England in 1778, too many people knew that continuing the war in America was going to be a disaster and it was not winnable. And as they learned from history, I am just really, can you elaborate a little bit on that, when that deciding point was that caused him to say, I have to go with my state or with my wife or whatever?
Sure, and I think that's an excellent question. And that was very much a real issue. And I'll draw your attention to a very fascinating point in history, which is, and I'll explain why this is so relevant to your question in a moment, but do you know who gave Robert E. Lee his final promotion in the Army, his final commission? Abraham Lincoln, and Robert E. Lee accepted it. It was a promotion to colonel. And the reason he accepted that promotion to colonel from Abraham Lincoln was because he genuinely thought that he had been convinced that somehow war was going to be avoided. The Virginia secession convention that was meeting in Richmond actually had a vote before the vote that I mentioned later, and it was overwhelmingly in favor of not seceding. But the convention stayed in session, and ultimately, of course, they're going to switch. Now, what switches the vote? Fort Sumter is what changes it. That crisis, Robert E. Lee has been monitoring the crisis. He sort of is saying that he hopes Lincoln will just back off, and he thinks that it's important for the South to see that the fort is going to be abandoned not because of military necessity, but because of political respect. He sort of thinks it's an opportunity to sort of let things cool off. Now, of course, that's not the option that Lincoln takes. He finds an option between abandoning the fort and actually starting a war. He lets Jefferson Davis start a war. And that moment is when the state, Virginia, felt it had to pick sides because Lincoln called up for volunteers. And it was very important to Lee. So after he meets with Francis Blair, as I told you, he goes over and he meets with his brother. He first meets with Winfield Scott, and then he meets with his brother, Sidney Smith Lee, who is a naval officer, and they talk about it, and then Lee goes back to Arlington. And then when he finally makes his decision to resign, he writes a letter to Sidney Smith saying, I had promised to talk this over with you one more time before making my decision, but my hand was forced. And what forced his hand? It was the feeling that he might get called to have direct orders to do something. And it's dishonorable for a U.S. Army soldier to resign under orders. You have to, if he's going to resign, he has to resign before those orders come in. So that's really what forced his hand, and I mentioned what forced Virginia's hand. But that's a terrific question, because it really was relevant to the way the nitty-gritty of those weeks played out.
Right here.
Hi, great talk. I'm John Mouse from the Army Center of Military History in Washington. I had a question for you on your interpretation. About 20 years ago, an historian whose last name I believe is McCaslin came out with a book called Lee and the Shadow of Washington.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And his interpretation was that Washington was always in Lee's mind, and Lee conducted himself militarily and personally with kind of this model of Washington. And then, I forget how many years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, Elizabeth Pryor's book, Reading the Man on Robert E. Lee, she seemed to have come out with a different interpretation that Lee, she tended to debunk some of this, the notion that Lee had Washington's portrait in his office at West Point, and that Lee modeled himself on that. Her interpretation, I believe, was that Lee didn't pay any more attention to Washington's influence than any other statesman would have at the time. Have you come to a conclusion on where that falls, or how do you feel about that?
Well, that's a great question, and so actually this debate goes back much further, because people were making these arguments immediately after the Civil War, and of course Douglas Southall Freeman, who is probably certainly Robert E. Lee's most famous biographer, deals with this in his book. How much did Washington weigh on Robert E. Lee? And Freeman concluded that it was, in fact, that Robert E. Lee looked up to George Washington. That was the model. And actually, when he decides to become a revolutionary, it's basically following the path that Washington had blazed, because Washington was a revolutionary. I think as you look through his childhood in Alexandria, I think I'm going to put myself kind of in a middle ground here, which is I don't think we have to make a decision between this idea that Robert E. Lee had patterned his whole life after George Washington, which is certainly not the case, because Robert E. Lee never had that kind of pretension about himself. He would have never said, if you cornered him and said, "Are you the second coming of George Washington?" He would have thought that was an insane question, and he never had that kind of arrogance to think of himself like that. But at the same time, I think it's equally ridiculous to say that someone could have all these connections to George Washington. His father could be George Washington's most famous eulogist, and he married the daughter of George Washington's adopted son and lived, because Arlington really was as close to a home as Robert E. Lee ever had, and say that all these things had no impact on a man. Remove Robert E. Lee from this equation completely and just zoom out and look at the beginning of the 19th century. The answer is every American worshipped George Washington. George Washington was a hero in every family. If you go and look at magazine articles from the early 19th century, what kind of parenting advice are they giving to moms and dads? The advice is, how can you raise your child to be like George Washington? And the most famous George Washington biography, not the best George Washington biography, but by Parson Weems, one of the most famous lines is that every youth may become a Washington. And who's reading that biography as a kid? Well, first of all, let me tell you whose name is on the cover page of that biography. A man named H. Lee, Harry Lee, who's saying that this is a great book for children to read. He's endorsing this book. And Abraham Lincoln's reading that biography, and he's hearing that every youth may become a Washington, which has a lot of meaning when you think about the fact that Abraham Lincoln grew up without any connection to George Washington and is now the American, I think, we most associate with George Washington. So I think the answer to your question is there's a middle ground here, and I sort of talked about this in my introduction. I think that's where the actual answer is. We don't have to pick a side here. The facts are as they are, and he wasn't the second coming of George Washington, but he might have been had he made a different choice in 1861.
Well, that's another interesting counterfactual. So if Lee plays the role of Washington, defends the Union successfully, do we have an America in which, family lineage matters more than the idea that anyone can become George Washington? That really, George Washington, you're going to find him in the descendants or close connections of that family.
I think that's exactly kind of the point that I think people should think about with this counterfactual. I'm glad you said it like that. It really captures what we should be thinking about. And the question is, will we be a better country because of that, or are we a better country because a man who grew up in Kentucky, he was born in Kentucky, and really had no connections to George Washington except for dragging around a book that was a pretty bad book. I mean, to be honest, if you read it now, and thinking and getting into his mind that he too could be a George Washington. I think there's a lot of value in that, and I think actually the fact that Robert E. Lee isn't the second coming of George Washington is very much responsible for the fact of the kind of country we are today, where we believe that anyone can grow up and become president of the United States, and anyone can, as Parson Weems might have said, become a Washington.
All right, who's next? In the back there, Stephen.
I have a question. I don't know how far you went in your research after the war and Lee becomes president of the university. And my understanding that he needed money, and a large amount of that money and contributions came from the North. And did you find any motivation for that? Was there a resurgence of Lee, or how did that happen in your view?
So, first a word about the college, and that is the story I talk about in the book, because what happens after Robert E. Lee leaves Appomattox? Well, he goes back to Richmond, and he's sort of playing around with the idea that maybe he'll become a farmer if the Union authorities will let him buy some land. He's not sure they'll even let him do that. And all of a sudden, this surprising offer comes from the Shenandoah Valley, from this college that's been destroyed during the Civil War. It's called Washington College in Lexington, Virginia. And Washington College isn't just called Washington College. It has a real connection to George Washington, and that's that George Washington provided a substantial endowment for it, and it changed its name in honor of George Washington. And most people think Robert E. Lee is going to turn down this offer because it's not worthy of him to go to Washington College, because it's, as I said, the college has barely survived the Civil War, and if Robert E. Lee really wants to be a university president, he can do better. But Lee thinks this is sort of, that fate again has intervened, and this is an offer that he needs to accept, because for 4 years he's led the young men of the South in war, and now he sees an opportunity to prepare them for peace. So he goes out to Washington College. And as you mentioned, the college is not doing well. It has very little money. And he starts a massive fundraising campaign for the college, and he does get money from different places. Now, there are people who are, some of the money will come from, for example, Virginians who had moved north and had done well and made some donations. But in time, he gets money from all parts of the Union. He also gets students from all across the South, and eventually there are some students actually who come to Washington Lee. Sorry, I said Washington Lee. I blew the punchline to this story. And eventually, even some students from above the Mason-Dixon line will come to Washington College. And then, of course, when Robert E. Lee dies, this college promptly renames itself. I wonder what the answer to this could be. Washington and Lee University, which today is one of our very best universities in America.
We just ranked number 2 in Virginia, which surprised me. But,
They're really a great school, and I spent some time out there researching this book, and I will actually tell you another fact about Washington Lee University, which is they have by far the best cafeteria food of any university in America. It's not even close.
Jonathan, they also have the Peale portrait of Washington that was in Arlington House. Did Lee bring that with him, or? Right.
So actually, a lot of they do have a lot of the relics, and so actually, at the beginning of the war. And this is just a coincidence, the Lees left a lot of the relics in Mount Vernon. It's Mary, his wife, who's trying to pack up and decide what to do. But she sends some boxes of the relics to Lexington, which is where Washington College is located, and they're buried underground. And another batch she takes with her, and she puts into a friend's house. And then some she leaves behind. And so, yes, eventually that portrait is going to be moved from one of the friends' houses to Lexington. And actually, if you go to Lexington and go to Washington Lee University, it's not just that portrait. They have an outstanding portrait collection of portraits that once belonged to Arlington.
All right, who's next? That gentleman.
Yeah, down the road at Fort Belvoir, one of my majors had as the centerpiece of his office a large portrait of Robert E. Lee. Now, this officer is from Boston. He didn't graduate from VMI or the Citadel, but his choice of artwork is not uncommon throughout the Army. Can you explain the continuing veneration of Lee today?
Well, I mean, in some sense, if you may be in a better position to explain it than I am, being in the Army. But I think traditionally, there's two things. First of all, after the Civil War, and this wasn't immediate. We shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that it was immediate, because there was a lot of hatred toward Robert E. Lee for a long time. In fact, when Robert E. Lee died, there was a senator who thought now would be a good time to stand up in the Senate and say, let's give Arlington back to the Lee family, and maybe we can even consider removing those graves and restoring the house. And this is in 1870, because he had seen some of the outcry, the outpouring of grief over Robert E. Lee's death, and even the New York Times had run an obituary that was quite positive about what Lee had done after the war. So anyway, he proposes this. He thinks it's the perfect time for this idea. And then senator after senator gets up and says Robert E. Lee was a traitor, and we're never giving that house back. Of course, in time, there's going to be a Supreme Court case about this, and that's something we can talk about a little bit later if we want. But to your point, eventually I think there becomes an agreement well after the war that you can respect a way a man fought, but not respect the cause that he fought for. And so that agreement is made. And then also Robert E. Lee is given a lot of credit for what he does after the war, which is he tells people to move on, to accept the outcome. Secession is dead. Slavery is dead. And you might say it was easy for Robert E. Lee to say secession is dead because he didn't support secession in 1861. But to be perfectly honest, Lee actually sort of revises his views after the war. And he actually, in his private writings, will be saying things that, like, maybe the Founding Fathers had said secession was okay after all. So he does pull a little bit of a flip-flop. But publicly, he keeps the stand that the war has decided the question. And the best thing that can happen is, because a lot of Southerners are thinking about leaving the country, going overseas, and he says, no, stay. The South needs her sons to stay and to rebuild.
Next question. Anyone? Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks. I was wondering about your personal journey and the relationship of your experiences in the Bush White House and all that entailed and all that the country was going through and still going through, and your choice of focusing on authoring a book and then this book. And I wondered, how are they related, if they are?
Sure, and that's a great question. I think to say, first of all, when you work at a White House, any White House, President Bush's White House, President Clinton's White House, President Obama's White House, you get just a terrific seat to watch history play out. And as a speechwriter especially, you get to see how leaders make decisions, because so often what the speech does is it explains how a president made his decision. So you get a sense of the factors that go into making a decision. So I think that's great training for anybody who actually wants to write a history book, is to get to see a leader, as I said, of any party. I'm not trying to make a partisan point here. Of any party, make a decision. It's really great training. The other thing is, as a speechwriter, history is a valuable tool for a speechwriter. So we're always naturally looking at history. And why are we looking at history? Well, because if you're going to make an argument for a policy or for a decision that a president has made, one of the very best arguments that we have, and I think one of the positions that the American people most respect, is if you go back and say, someone you respect in the past made a similar decision. If you go listen again to President Obama or President Bush or any recent president, everyone is trying to make arguments in the same way, which is trying to say, we've done this before, it worked, and this is in line with our values as a country. So I think working as a speechwriter at the White House was just great training for me, and it was just a great opportunity. I got quite lucky to be able to be there.
Great. Interesting. Yes, sir, right here.
Thanks for the talk. I just had a question. In your research, did you ever find an instance of Lee actually visiting Mount Vernon? And I think it's interesting to think of another counterfactual. If John Washington hadn't sold the plantation to the Mount Vernon ladies, possibly Mount Vernon could have suffered some sort of retribution for being the home of a Confederate soldier. But yeah, if you have any insights on either of those.
Yeah, no, and first of all, that your second point is very valid. That's a good point. Without the Mount Vernon Ladies Association being in possession of Mount Vernon, who knows what would have happened. That was very lucky for us as a country, because I don't know what would have happened, but it's another counterfactual. Let's just be very happy we don't have to ask what would have happened.
There'd be no library.
Robert E. Lee did come to Mount Vernon. He was certainly here in 1832, shortly after he married. He came here for a funeral of one of Martha Washington's granddaughters had died, and actually Robert E. Lee writes a letter shortly afterward. The letter is most famous, of course, and I hope no one gets offended by this, but Robert E. Lee is writing this letter. He's writing to a girl who he used to flirt with in Savannah, Georgia. And she had just gone, when he starts the letter, she's about on the verge of her wedding night. And then he gets called away to this funeral, and then he sits back down and finishes the letter. And so he says, after he describes why he had to take a break in writing the letter, he goes, he can't resist, and he's married at this point, but he can't resist asking how her wedding night went. So he said, and how did you do? Did you, I don't have the exact quote here, but did you go off well like a torpedo cracker on Christmas morning? So I'm going to let you all try to decide what that means.
Awful.
Anyway, so Robert E. Lee had a sense of humor, and that's another thing I think that surprises a lot of people. And so I hope that answers your question.
Before we take this next one, question about, oh my goodness, it fled from my mind. Go ahead, I'll think of it again.
I'm just curious about the bonds, the closeness with his classmates at West Point. Were most of them irrevocably broken after the war, or did a lot of people still respect, particularly his classmates, the decisions he made? And the second thing is, obviously he was a strategist, and he must have known the odds of winning when he took over, the Southern armies and stuff. The odds, the outcome. Did he ever think it was preordained, or did he truly believe that they had a chance at victory?
And those are two great questions. Let me start with the second one. At the start of the war, you have a lot of people in Richmond who Robert E. Lee is hearing are saying, Yankees can't fight. This war will be over really quickly. We'll be in Washington, and the Confederate flag is going to be flying above the Capitol and the White House. That's sort of the initial plan. And Robert E. Lee doesn't take that view at all. He says this war could take a decade if Virginia can hold out for 10 weeks, because he realizes how unprepared the South is for a war. And if you just look at the state of Virginia, you can immediately realize why. It's incredibly open to attack from all kinds of different avenues. And so he actually starts off, as his commission initially is with Virginia. So he's in the challenges of to defend Virginia against all of these different lines of attack. He has a grasp of how hard the odds are. He's also, as an Army officer, he's traveled this country, and he knows that Yankees can and will fight. He doesn't have this kind of bravado, and he actually writes his wife that he finds it quite offensive that other people do, and it bothers him throughout the war. He goes deeper into the South in that first year of the war. He heads down to South Carolina and Georgia, and he says that he's really bothered because a lot of the people who most wanted to fight this war don't really have any interest in doing any work. and they're just rather complain that other people aren't doing work. So he was very much aware of the odds against him at all points. Now, did he think he couldn't win? No, I think at different points, I don't think we can say that it was impossible for Robert E. Lee to emerge victorious in the Civil War, because if writing this book has taught me nothing else, it's that nothing in history is inevitable. And of course, there were moments when things could have turned out differently. We can't say exactly when those moments were, but certainly Lee thought there were moments. For example, at the 7 Days outside Richmond in 1862, George McClellan is closing in on Richmond. He's got this enormous force, and Lee manages, through a series of maneuvers, which I describe in the book, to basically throw McClellan off balance, and McClellan starts retreating, and he saves Richmond. But Lee's furious because he thinks that if his orders had been properly carried out, McClellan's entire army would have been destroyed. And so he says if my orders were carried out, he wouldn't be getting away. Same thing at the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863. You think of that probably as Robert E. Lee's greatest victory. And that's what we're told. But Robert E. Lee wasn't so happy afterwards because he felt that Joseph Hooker's army should have been destroyed. And he's angry that Hooker managed to get away. Now, actually, if you ask Lee's aides, Lee was actually planning one last frontal assault against Joseph Hooker and the Army of the Potomac at Chancellorsville. And actually, Lee's aides say this assault would not have gone very well because Hooker actually had a very strong position. And so, in some sense, Lee avoided making a mistake because Hooker made a mistake of retreating. And I'm sorry, I've been talking so much I forgot your first question. Oh, yes. Right. So certainly that plays, that dynamic. The officers know each other. And what's fascinating actually is that Lee and McClellan, who knew each other, they didn't overlap. They weren't together at West Point. McClellan was quite a deal younger than Lee, but they obviously had shared training. So Lee had an idea of, they were both engineers. And what's so interesting about Lee and McClellan is they both use the same word to describe each other. And do you know what that word is? Timid. So, yeah, so that's what McClellan's initial impression of Lee was. And if there's some Freudian in the house, maybe he can help us figure that one out. But
2 more questions. Make them good. I forgot mine, so couldn't have been that good.
Excellent talk, and really looking forward to reading the book. I've been kind of reading a little bit as you talk. Answer some of the questions, so I hope I didn't miss something. But you worked in the White House, Mr. Horn, and you know that what ambition is like. It surrounds you. Everyone there, I'm sure, is very ambitious. The same was true in the military. And I was struck, as I saw in your book, you said Lee, when he made his decision, said he had no ambition to do anything else once he decided to take himself out. But just a month before, he had been promoted to colonel by President Lincoln. I'm always a skeptic that when somebody says he doesn't have ambition. Is it possible that Lee really, made a judgment that his ambition would best be served if things played out a certain way for him to lead the Confederate cause? Maybe eventually the Union would be reunited. But how big a role was, his ambition inside his head? Maybe not what he admitted to his brother or to others, but how big a role do you think it played in his actions?
So, and certainly, I mean, going through, Lee graduated from West Point and he becomes an engineer, which is then probably the most prestigious branch of the Army to go into. He graduated second in his class from West Point, and there's a lot of frustration because for him, he feels like it's hard to move up. And so there is a sense of frustration. The promotion doesn't necessarily come as quickly as you might like. He transfers to the cavalry at some point shortly before the Civil War, where he then goes to Texas. And there's always a sense that he sort of has this frustration that his career really isn't going anywhere. And this is even after, I should say, this is even after the Mexican-American War, where he really did impress all of his superiors. But Lee still sort of feels like his career is sort of going nowhere, and it takes him away from his family, and he's constantly feeling torn between the Army and Arlington, where his family is, because he goes to Texas, as I mentioned, in the years before the Civil War, and he can't bring his wife to Texas because his wife, we haven't even gotten to touch on this, but she's has suffering medical problems, but actually in some ways that are very reminiscent of Robert E. Lee's mother. So certainly there was ambition. To your point, did Lee genuinely think, and the point you're referring to is after he resigns from the U.S. Army, he says that day maybe he can just stay home and sit out this war. Was that a genuine feeling? Well, obviously 3 days later he's accepting command of all of Virginia's armed forces. But I think things did happen quickly. I'm not sure we can say I'm not sure we can discount what he says himself. There obviously was something in 19th century writing. George Washington did it a lot too, to sort of play down what your ambition was. And certainly Lee was very capable of doing that too. But I think he realized that this decision was going to be a disaster for him. I think he knew the second he accepts that command in Richmond, the president of Virginia Secession Convention says your duty is to defend every inch of Virginia. And Robert E. Lee is already writing to his wife, you better evacuate Arlington because there's no way I can defend that. So I think he realized that this was going to be a very personally devastating decision. So I can't say that he really, I certainly don't think it was something he ever wanted to happen to him.
I'll ask one before the last one. This is not the one I had before, but a new one. It has to do with Jefferson Davis.
Yes.
With that name, Jefferson Davis, I mean, was he associated with Washington as well? And where did Jefferson fit in all this sort of rigmarole?
Well, the Confederacy very much claims George Washington as their own. It's not just the Union that's going to claim George Washington, right? And Jefferson Davis is going to have an inauguration on what day? February 22nd. That's not a coincidence. So George Washington is important to both sides. Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis have a very interesting relationship, and because Davis, in some ways, would prefer not to be the president of the Confederacy. He would rather be a general because that's where he sees his talents. He sees himself as a military man. And because he sees himself as a military man, he actually runs into a lot of friction with a lot of his military men because he thinks he knows better than they do. And so what allows him to work with Robert E. Lee is that Robert E. Lee is very skillful in sort of cultivating this relationship, and he sort of presents himself as somebody who's sort of, he can listen to Davis. He knows how to give the sense that he doesn't need to have his own way. And that's sort of, again, part of Lee's personality. And he ends up earning Davis's complete trust to the point that Lee makes some decisions during the war and you see very little correspondence to Davis about them. And it's kind of amazing that Lee has that much trust.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, I was intrigued by the question, hypothetically, you raised. What would happen if Lee had assumed command of the Northern Army? Would he have done better? I guess my question to you, looking at the character of Lee compared to Grant, even though Lee was a brilliant strategist, it seemed to me that Grant had that dogged determination that you really needed because the North had the men and the supplies. They needed to have a bulldog kind of run that army. And it seemed like Grant was the perfect man once Lincoln found him. Your thoughts on that?
Well, certainly Grant was perfect for that role, and I think you have two great generals. Though it's a mistake to think that Lee, first of all, didn't understand what was happening when he faced Grant. I mean, at least he had his own feeling about what was happening, and he certainly was. And Robert E. Lee, the numbers will show, was not afraid to fight. He was certainly willing to fight too. Again, I don't think we can answer the question. I mean, it was a different point in the war when Grant comes in. And he comes to the Eastern Theater. A lot has happened. The views on the war have changed. The Emancipation Proclamation has happened. So had Robert E. Lee accepted that command and won the Civil War very quickly by taking Richmond, you can make all kinds of scenarios for why that might not have been a good thing because maybe we would have never gotten to emancipation. I mean, there's just who knows what would have happened. And so, again, I'm not trying to dodge your question, but it's impossible for me to say. It's not really something a historian can answer because it didn't happen.
Well, on that note, the impotence of historians, thank you very much.
That's where I began. That's where I began this journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's really spectacular. Obviously, we were all engaged, could have kept going. Now, you all have an opportunity to buy this marvelous book if you don't own it already. You'll get your rebate as well. Buy one for your friends. And Jonathan will be here to sign them to you or to anyone right up. We're not going to let them leave, so you're going to be right over here. So let's. And I hope to see you again, but let's give him one last round of applause.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Books are for sale right outside the door.